I guess what has happened for Marcus Rashford over these last 6 months makes it not completely a closed door. He has become legit one of the best players in Serie A. I think he'll be a huge hit in the Premier League. If I was giving any bit of advice to Chelsea, just do it, get it over the line. He will have an enormously positive impact on that Chelsea dressing room, something that they really need, as well as being an enormous upgrade in the position that he is.
Hello, I'm Angelina Kelly and welcome to The Window, talkSPORT's daily video transfer update and your go-to guide for all the biggest football moves. Coming up, we will be chatting all things Manchester United, whether Arsenal should be worried about Real Madrid hijacking one of their transfers, Manchester City's prospective new signings, plus so much more. And joining me today is talkSPORT's European football journalist, Andy Brassell. Andy, great to speak to you. First up, let's just get this one out of the way. Cristiano Ronaldo, have you got an update? What is going on with him?
It seems like Gianni Infantino might have overstepped the mark. I know that'll be a surprise to you and many people watching. But when he went on YouTube and said, well, he could end up somewhere on loan for the World Cup. Well, maybe he won't. Maybe he'll just be watching it at home. Of course, Infantino, it was his big mission to find a way to squeeze in Leo Messi. Remember, Inter Miami were awarded a place for the best regular season in MLS history, as he put it, when he was giving them that place on the pitch. Of course, they also went out in the first round of the playoffs following that. So not the season that Messi or Inter Miami really wanted. And I guess he's been thinking it would be lovely to shoehorn Cristiano Ronaldo into it as well, especially as it's in the States and it's the sort of precursor to the World Cup next year. But look, Al Nassr are not massively pleased with that, as you can imagine. They're still pretty confident that they'll manage to get him to an extension. And they've always enjoyed a really good relationship with him as well. We have to say that.
Moving on to Manchester United, his former club. They have already secured Matheus Cunha. Bryan Mbeumo is on the cards next. Where do you sit with their transfer strategy so far? Have you been impressed?
I think the glaring miss is a centre forward. Even though I think the two signings is very little arguing with them so far, because we know they're both excellent performers in the Premier League, and they're in an area of the pitch where United could maybe do with a little bit more quality. I think it's fair to say. Of course, we know that wide players, in particular, is something that, and wide players who can score goals is something that's very important to Amorim. You found that quickly they were really, really reliant on Amad Diallo, and excellent as he's been under Amorim, that's not something that can continue. They need greater depth than that, and what better competition or addition than two players who we know could do it in the Premier League already, particularly in Mbeumo for that spot that Amad's taking. I guess that the question is, as well as the absence of a proper centre forward, in inverted commas, a real number 9, which we know that Cunha is not. He's effective in deeper positions behind a main striker. I guess even though they don't play exactly the same position, I'm a little bit concerned over what bringing Cunha means now that it looks like Bruno Fernandes is staying. Now, I guess the obvious answer to that is Bruno Fernandes plays a kind of deeper role, but they perform, even though they've got different positions, fairly similar functions in the team, because they have similar personalities football-wise. They are two guys who want to put the team on their back and take all the responsibility. Now, I guess if Bruno Fernandes is staying, the best way for United to evolve is to not have one player that they lean on all the time. So maybe this is an entirely healthy thing for them. But personality-wise, one of them is going to have to give a bit. I don't think there's any doubt about that, because why Bruno has been so incredibly successful for Manchester United is because from the moment he arrived at Old Trafford, he got to do exactly what he was doing at Sporting, which is just pick up the team and pull it forward. And it was a similar sort of role, not just tactically, but morally and spiritually, really. That was the same sort of thing that he was doing at Sporting. So I guess as he's hitting 30, it is the time to show Bruno that there is a future for United beyond them just leaning hard on him. And maybe that's something that Cunha can help with. But I still want to see that number 9, and obviously that really relies on who they can sell.
talkSPORT's chief football correspondent Alex Crook, his wording was Fernandes wants to continue his career in a top European league. Could this mean that if a side like, let's say for argument's sake, Bayern Munich were to come in for him, he could be more tempted? Do you think a move like that could be likely? Are there any possible suitors on the continent?
I don't think there are, Angelina. We all know Bruno Fernandes is an absolutely top quality player, but I guess it feels as if he's someone who's got that personality. He's a great captain for Manchester United for my money. By far their outstanding player last season. Goodness knows what last season would have looked like if he hadn't have been there. And I think he's a great example to younger players. I know people have an issue with him getting after referees and stuff at that time. I tend to think he falls into the sort of John Terry bracket, really, in terms of that. And I don't really have a massive problem with it. But I just think that he is still a guy that you're going to build a team around. And if you think of all the other clubs in Europe that would be considered a step up from United, and the ones that could afford him, really, is really tough to see what team is going to spend Premier League wages on a guy who's heading into his 30s, who we know is a great player, but a win now player. I think, he's not a player for a 10-year future. That's clear. If it was a Bayern or a PSG, are they really going to give Bruno Fernandes the keys to the team? I don't think so. I can understand if he wants to stay in Europe. I think United, where he's got great status and great respect, is the best place for him.
You were mentioning the number 9 earlier as well. There's reports of Rasmus Hojlund being linked to Inter Milan, a return to Italy. Where do you sit with that? Do you think that would be the best option for him?
Well, I think we've seen players who've struggled in the Premier League, and actually players who struggled at Manchester United, really thriving in Serie A after they've moved on. Obviously, you look at Lukaku, you look at Chris Smalling, Mkhitaryan. The list is practically endless, really. So we know that Hojlund had a really good start to his career in Serie A. I tended to think at the time, and I said this on Trans Europe Express with Danny Kelly at the time, I felt that he probably went a year too early, at least, because he just started to make a dent in the Atalanta first team, and then all of a sudden he's expected to lead the line for United in the Premier League, a United team with ambitions, which is a massive, massive step up. And I feel as if the load on him has been a bit too much. Now, what is clear is that United are going to have to loan him this summer, because I think unless they're prepared to take a massive hit on what they paid, they're not going to get anything like what they paid for him. There's going to have to be probably some compromise on wages as well. So really, to just get him into a state where his value is inflated and they're able to put him on the market, they need to loan him out somewhere. They need to send him somewhere where he can show what he can do. Now, look, I think we saw in his early games for Denmark, the potential is there. And, Denmark had a centre-forward shaped hole big time at the time when he came into the reckoning for the senior national team. So we saw then, and I think what convinced United, that there was a guy who not only had something now, but could really develop into something. Now, obviously, the pressure at United is such that any sort of misstep is treated as a disaster sometimes. We know, because we're sat here talking about it now, United are massive news, despite the fact that they had a poor season last season and finished 8th the season before, even if they did win the FA Cup. So, look, I think somewhere where he can go, get game time, and I think the difficulty is he's not as good as Marcus Thuram or Lautaro Martinez. So unless the next coach of Inter, whoever that might be, is going to rotate a lot more, and of course they'll imagine themselves going deep into all competitions like Coppa Italia and the Champions League again next season, will he get the consistency of game time for United to inflate his value to the point where they can sell him for a reasonable amount of money? I think that would be the big question with Inter. Serie A, definitely. Inter, not sure.
Meanwhile, one player that they cannot get rid of is Jadon Sancho. He's returning to Manchester after Chelsea paid a £5 million penalty to get out of their obligation to buy the winger. Realistically, where do you think he could go?
I think, again, there's quite a small clutch of clubs where he could go, really. I mean, clearly he's too expensive for Dortmund to go back there, and he wasn't convincing enough for them to want to push the boat out last summer. Not that I think they're able to in terms of a permanent deal, but in terms of a loan, even for them to pay the bulk of what the wages would have been beyond their capabilities. And so he's ended up going to this season at Chelsea, and there's just so much competition for places. It has been hard for him to find that sort of consistency that we know that he's capable of. You know, we've heard that Chelsea feel he's not consistent enough. I think it's very, very hard to be consistent in that sort of environment, especially with so much competition. Now, we've seen at moments the quality that he still has, and that was never in doubt anyway. I think the mention of West Ham is interesting, because I do feel that Graham Potter needs players of flair to play the sort of football that he wants to work on from pre-season. Obviously, Potter was left with the hand that he was left with when he took over the West Ham job halfway through last season. He'll want to really put his mark on it this season. And Jadon Sancho will really want to put his mark on the Premier League. And I think to go to a place where he knows he's going to play every week, to play in the Premier League and to be able to finally prove himself in the Premier League, I think is a pretty good opportunity for him, because all the sort of top clubs that would have been interested in him going back, well, a year and a half, 2 years now, his wages are too much for them to really want to take a risk. Because at the moment, even though he showed a good attitude and I think showed good things at moments for Chelsea, he's still a bit of a salvage project. And he's a bit expensive to be a salvage project. So really, I think you need a team to take a chance on a player who would be taking a chance on that team as well.
Talking about Marcus Rashford now, the Times have reported that Barcelona are facing the threat of UEFA sanctions after breaching its financial rules for a second consecutive year. One of them could be a reduced limit on the number of players they can register for next season's Champions League. So, is Rashford seriously going to get a move there, especially when you look at how many options they've got going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the headline here is the fact that Deco, the sporting director, of course, formerly of Chelsea, has said from the off, and a lot of us have looked at Barcelona and particularly the way that they went out of the Champions League when they dominated most of their semi-final in both legs against Inter. I think we can look at it as laymen and say, well, probably they want to improve defensively. That's not Deco's call. He says that they need players to cover Lamine Yamal and Rafinha, because they're so important to them that they need a bit of help and they need a bit of relief. They can't play 60 games a season. And, you know, I think that's fair enough. But as you've said, they've got a limited budget, so they've got to be very, very careful with it. Now, I guess, like Manchester United to a lesser extent, and I think we can overlook Barcelona's problems because they've been so beautiful on the pitch to watch this season. They're going to need to generate some cash somewhere along the line. Now, the easiest way of generating that cash is to find somewhere to put Robert Lewandowski, because he has a slightly reduced wage to the one that he had last season in this coming season, but it's still a massive chunk out of their budget. Now, they won't be able to reinvest all of that because they're above the cap in American sports terms, but that they will be able to reinvest some of it. Now, I guess what has happened for Marcus Rashford over these last 6 months makes it not completely a closed door, because we always said that there was, again, a small amount of teams who would be able to take Marcus Rashford because of those wages. To me, it felt always like quite an onerous deal for Aston Villa. Like, keeping Asensio, I get it. Keeping both of them, how can they do it? I just don't understand how they can do it, unless I'm massively misunderstanding the numbers and the amount of their turnover that Villa spend on wages. I think it's way too risky. I think a lot of us look at Marcus Rashford and we want him to be great. We want it to be the great comeback. And we saw plenty of positive signs at Villa, but did we see enough that you'd bet the farm on him? I don't think so. And we know that there's been mutual interest between Rashford and Barcelona for a while. I think the situation that United are in and the situation that Rashford's in, again, it's a little bit like Hojlund. I think they have to send him somewhere on loan to get him to a point where they can sell him, because really the investment that he requires is just too much to ask at the moment for anyone. So if we're talking about a situation where Barcelona and United would split the wages to some extent, then it's possible. I guess there are two questions. Firstly, how much Rashford digs his heels in, if he's really desperate for this move, if he's prepared to turn down other interest and, really run the risk of staying at Manchester United if the transfer window passes and he doesn't get the move he wants. And I guess the second part of it is how far are Barcelona prepared to leave it? Because I think the nearer they get to deadline, the nearer they get to September, the more chance they've got of getting something like this over the line. Because at that point, United presumably will go in with an idea of what they want at this moment. They will say publicly, I'm sure, that they want to sell him. I guess the further they get towards the deadline, they'll find out that that's probably not possible. And then the closer they get to the deadline, the more likely it is that they'll be stuck with him and all of his wages not playing. So the more likely they are to be able to compromise. I could definitely see it happening, but I think it'll be a waiting game.
Switching gears now to Chelsea, they currently have a lot of goalkeepers on their books. I'm counting 7. So according to their official website, we have as senior goalkeepers Robert Sanchez, Filip Jorgensen, Marcus Bettinelli, Lucas Bergstrom, Georgi Petrovic, Kepa Arrizabalaga, those two on loan of course, and there's Mike Penders joining this summer, but they're being linked with another option in Mike Maignan. The 29-year-old is France's number 1. He's got 1 year left on his AC Milan contract. The rumoured fees are around £25 million. What can you tell us about these reports? And also, Manchester United, Manchester City, amongst others, need goalkeepers as well. Maignan's always been highly rated. Why do you think no other team has gone in for him before now, or indeed a rival in Chelsea for his signature this summer?
Well, I think that's a really good question, because if I was giving any bit of advice to Chelsea, just do it, get it over the line, because you've gone through all those goalkeepers, Angelina, and I want to hold fire on Mike Penders because he's young and I've not really seen anything of him. But Maignan is better than all of those by a mile as well. It's not even close. He's one of the best goalkeepers in the world. He's good with his feet. And I think the most important thing, as well as the fact that he has presence and he's so great on the pitch, in the changing room, he's brilliant as well. Now, ever since he took over from Hugo Lloris, who, remember, is the longest serving France captain as well as the longest serving France goalkeeper, 3 or 4 caps in, he was taking the lead in the dressing room, giving advice to the other players. You go back to last year after a couple of negative results, and he would say to the face of Antoine Griezmann and Kylian Mbappe, look, you're not doing enough. You need to do more. Not every player can do that, and not every player can be listened to like that. He's not a loud guy, but when he speaks, he is listened to by players who he's worked with everywhere. So I think especially the contractual situation that he's in, I think for a long time, no one believed that he would be available from Milan because he had a great influence there. He was competing in the Champions League, winning trophies, challenging for trophies. And now all of a sudden, I think people have become aware of his contractual situation and thought, hang on, here's an opportunity. Now, of course, I think a lot of people will look at this and say it's not a very Chelsea signing because of his age. He'd be the oldest player in the team if he went in. But this is exactly what they need. The talent at Chelsea is absolutely undeniable. We've seen it at the good bits of the last season. But sometimes there's been a question over leadership. And I think when you're working this sort of Moneyball angle, and we've seen it before, at the Red Bull clubs, we've seen it at Leipzig and Salzburg, for example. Really, you need those senior players to really accelerate the development of the younger players. So you can look at it and say, well, where's the sell on and all that sort of stuff. It's not really about that. It's about preserving and maximising the sell on of the players around you. Those players will learn so much from playing with a guy like Maignan, with listening to a guy like Maignan in the dressing room. So not only has he got plenty of years left as a goalkeeper, he will have an enormously positive impact on that Chelsea dressing room, something that they really need, as well as being an enormous upgrade in the position that he is, because this is France's number one goalkeeper, undisputed number one goalkeeper, and one of the very best goalkeepers in the world.
I think you have definitely sold that to the Chelsea fans that are watching. They will be very excited with that. Going to another part of London now, Arsenal. Let's try and give the Arsenal fans some positivity. I mean, one player, Martin Zubimendi, for about 6 months now, I feel like they've been linked with him. And by all indications, people are saying the deal is basically done. However, he was interviewed by Spanish radio yesterday and was a little more coy about his future and spoke about new Real Madrid manager Xabi Alonso, describing him as his hero. Should Arsenal fans be a bit worried?
Not yet. I think, yeah, maybe, if we see him arriving in Madrid airport, even if it's only to change planes to go on holiday, you're allowed a little moment of tension, I think. But look, he has been pretty clear on what he wants his future to be. Arsenal have believed that they're getting him for a number of months now, and there's no reason to believe that he's misled him. Now, of course, remember that we can talk about Xabi Alonso and his link with Real Sociedad, but Mikel Arteta's got the same. He grew up a couple of doors away, didn't he, from Alonso? So in terms of that, I think the connection's still there, the feeling's there. And look, I think if you look what Arsenal really want, I think when people have gone, well, is he of the same sort of physical power as Thomas Partey? Well, no, but that's really not what they've needed. I think we've seen from really where Arsenal are, is in some ways physically he's more at the Jorginho end of the market, but Jorginho is clearly not dynamic enough, and clearly not been dynamic enough for a while to play all the games. And Zubimendi is a different type of player. If you're talking about Arsenal, and they were criticised a little bit last season for maybe being a little bit slower in possession than they were, as well as breaking up the play, bringing the ball from his own half to the opposition half is what Zubimendi is really good at, and doing it at a reasonable lick of pace as well. So he's not just a player that's going to release Declan Rice to go a little bit further forward. He's a player that's really going to add tempo to that Arsenal team, as well as protecting the defence. I mean, we saw really the massive impact that he made in the Euro final against England, and I think ever since then, a lot of English clubs have been pretty sold on him. And I can understand why. Of course, Liverpool were in last season. I mean, he is someone who, it would have been very easy for him to take that Liverpool move. And I think a lot of people would have understood that. He looked at the situation at Real Sociedad and he thought, well, I love this club, and a couple of big players are already going this summer. Of course, Merino went to Arsenal, who he knows very well already. And Robin Lenormand went to Atletico as well. So I didn't really want to leave them in the lurch. And that's kind of ended up with him treading water in a worse team than they were the season before. So, he's ambitious. He's ready to go. And I think it will be Arsenal still, to be honest, because I think Real Madrid needs something in their midfield. And I'm sure he would help them. But on the other hand, they've got a lot of good midfielders already. What they've really been lacking in the last little while is the replacement for that sort of experience, with them sort of overplaying Luka Modric last year, really missing Toni Kroos last year. And those are not easy questions for them to answer, but they've already got all the raw materials. And I think really their first things need to be sorting out their defence.
Arsenal fans can breathe a sigh of relief. Thank you for that one. Now, a former Arsenal player who's hit the headlines, Cesc Fabregas. So, Inter Milan manager Simone Inzaghi is leaving. He's heading to Saudi Arabia's Al Hilal. They are reportedly lining up former Arsenal captain and Como manager Fabregas as his replacement. For those who maybe haven't been keeping their eye on him, what kind of job has he done at Como and what kind of football does he play?
A really good job, because bear in mind they came up to the top flight last season after a long absence. Now, clearly there's been heavy investment in Como. That much is clear. I think people are already aware of that. So it's not as if he's been getting by with scrubs in his team. You know, there's been some quality players that have come on, particularly in the last 6 months, where Kakare, Diao have arrived. He's been working with Nico Paz all season, who they got from Real Madrid. Of course, Real Madrid have a buyback for him, and he's been terrific in the number 10 role. But I think it's not been massively exciting football, if I'm being perfectly honest. Now, that hasn't put other clubs off, bearing that in mind. I think a bit of defensive security is something quite nice. You know, we all insure our houses and cars, for goodness sakes. You know, it's not partying all the time, is it? So I think there's also probably an understanding that there is scope for him to play slightly more exciting football at another team with better players. The Como situation is quite complicated because, of course, he's been invested in it for a while. And I don't just mean invested in terms of the work he's done there, because even though he didn't have his pro license, so he wasn't the name above the door when they got promoted to the top flight, he had a huge role in that as well. And before properly officially taking over last season for the first season back in Serie A, I think the fact that he's actually got a shareholding in the club is a big deal. He's tied to a pretty long contract as well, so it wouldn't be a cheap deal to get him out of. He's talked to a few clubs already this summer. He had really positive discussions with Bayer Leverkusen. Now, I suspect that a big part of why he didn't accept that, because for a long time it did look as if he was going to go to Bayer Leverkusen to replace Xabi Alonso, his former international teammate. I think he's probably had a look at that and thought, oh God, this is a hell of a job to try and follow up on. And the fact that Leverkusen are going to lose a few players this summer as well. Jonathan Tah's going, of course, Florian Wirtz we're expecting to go to Liverpool too. I think that is a heck of a difficult job to take on. I mean, we're talking Moyes at Man United sort of business potentially, aren't we? You know, you could get into a sticky spot pretty quickly, especially as he's a relatively inexperienced coach still. Now, I think you look at the Inter deal and that's slightly different because they are obviously about an hour up the road from where he lives already, and he's a family guy, so that is something that I think is really important to him. Obviously, there'd still be the issue of him extricating himself from the shareholding situation. Now, whether he'd park the shares in blind trust or given to a family or friend, I've really no idea. But it's something that doesn't feel insurmountable. I think as well, the way that it was left with Simone Inzaghi at Inter, especially with that beating that they took in the final of the Champions League, that maybe gives him a little more space. Now, Beppe Marotta, the general manager, has said for a while that Inter want to get younger. I think we can see why in the Champions League final, because PSG made them look really old. And we've known that this is pretty much this squad's last chance at the Champions League. They are going to need to get younger because firstly, they need to be a bit more dynamic on the pitch. Secondly, they need to find a way to generate money because they need players that they can sell on at some point. They realise where Serie A is in the hierarchy of global leagues at the moment, and to sell a player or two to the Premier League further down the line would be pretty handy to them. I've no doubt about that. But Fabregas has got a couple of advantages going in there. Firstly, the fact that even though Inzaghi has been a terrific coach for Inter, he's left on a bit of a down note, so he gets to pick up and maybe reanimate the team, give it a bit more dynamism. The other thing is, if he wants to play relatively safety first football, no one's really going to rag on him for that. He's not expected to, like, when you go to Leverkusen, if you're following Alonso, you have to play good football because they have played such incredibly exciting football over the last 2.5 years. And I think both in results and style, that's incredibly hard to follow. Whereas Inter, I think the fan base understand that there's a little bit of a changeover that needs to happen. There's a little bit of a refresh that needs to happen. Does that mean that they can't win the league next season? No, I don't think it does mean that. And obviously that would be a brilliant opportunity for Fabregas to get in that position with a team with good players already, with resource, with desire to get younger, and a real chance to have a go at the Scudetto next season. So I think of all the ones that have been offered to Fabregas, and Leipzig have asked about him, Roma have asked about him, so many clubs are interested about him. I think as well as the job that he's done at Como, he's such a convincing talker about the game. I think that people really, really respond to that. So I could see it happening. I still wonder if it would maybe be a year too soon for him, if he wouldn't benefit from staying at Como. But then again, I guess you ask yourself, what can you do with Como in their current form? Is Europe a possibility? Because there's an enormous logjam, just like in the Premier League, at the top of Serie A, that's going to make it incredibly hard to get into the top 6 or 7. So maybe he does decide that this is the right move for him and, as we said, for his family.
Elsewhere, Manchester City. Now, I know that they're linked to Lyon's Ryan Cherki. I know that you are a fan of his. But they reportedly also have a verbal agreement in place for Dutch midfielder Tijjani Reijnders. The deal for the AC Milan player is reportedly worth around €70 million. What kind of player is he? What kind of player is Cherki? And would Reijnders fit into City's system, maybe as a Gundogan replacement or an upgrade?
Yeah, I think he could be, because what they've got with Reijnders and potentially Cherki are two players who are on an upward trajectory. And as City are trying to get younger, trying to get more dynamic, these are exactly the sort of players that they should be looking at. Now, Reijnders came to Milan pretty unheralded a couple of seasons ago after doing very well at AZ, but it felt like an enormous leap. And he has become legit one of the best players in Serie A. And he really was this season as well. Added more goals to his game. He's athletic. He's dynamic. He links the midfield with the attack. He's physical. All those things that you would really want from a Premier League midfielder, with added goal scoring and creativity. Now, there's no such thing as a replacement for Kevin De Bruyne. We can just bin that idea straight away. It's not possible to get one player who can replace him. But what they can do is get a couple of younger players who replicate some of the functions that he does and add something a little bit different. In terms of the legs that he would add, I think it feels like a great fit for City. And you place him in front of either Rodri or Rodri and Nico, and I think already the fact that Manchester City feel quite lumbering and worn out for most of last season, and we've talked about dynamism a couple of times in this, and that's definitely what they were lacking last season. This is another step in the right direction after Nico, after Marmoush. I think it would be a great thing for City. And I think he'll be a huge hit in the Premier League. With Cherki, it's a really interesting signing, because remember, go back to last summer, the back end of the transfer window, both Crystal Palace and Fulham had offers accepted for him around the €15 million mark. So what's about 12 million quid. He didn't entertain those offers for a minute. He refused to speak to either Palace or Fulham. Now, I can understand why Palace and Fulham fans might be a little annoyed about that. But look, he's always seen himself at an elite club. If he leaves his hometown club, Lyon, which he is now, he said that after the final game of the season. He was in tears when he came off in the final game against Angers. I think he always saw himself going to an elite level club. So it looked like that might be PSG or Dortmund for the first half of last summer. And when that didn't come through, then the offers from Palace and Fulham to try and force Lyon's hand came about and try and force Cherki's hand came about. But he's a willful guy who knows what he wants to do. He's always had everything technically. 2 good feet, incredible balance, one of the best dribblers you'll ever see. But really what happened last summer, I think, made him think, okay, Now I've really got to roll my sleeves up and take it to the next level. He was really well coached by Pierre Sage, who's not there anymore, and just encouraged to be a little bit more grown up and at the disposition of the team. So he's gone from having lots of ability to actually becoming a great player now. Two equally good feet. The only other player I can think of in that sort of position really is Zubimendi. He's become more of a goal scorer. As I said, the dribbling is still there, but he uses it more sparingly. He's got a better understanding of when to hold on to the ball and when to release it. And you can see that from the fact he's got over 20 assists last season. And seemingly he's clipped with Pep Guardiola when they've spoken to each other as well. Look, I've no idea where City would use him, whether they would use him as a 10 or one of the wide players, but a little bit like De Bruyne, even though he's not of the same physical stature or obviously the same maturity, I think the fact that you could use him in those different places means that he could replace some aspects of De Bruyne. And the fact that he can get stuff done in tight spaces as well is another massive advantage. So again, I think it would be a great signing for City.
And finally, the agreement between Jobe Bellingham and Borussia Dortmund is reportedly done. It's a 5-year contract. He's following in his brother's footsteps. Is this a good thing? Will the pressure be on? Is this another part of Dortmund's strategy of, buying young and selling them back to English clubs for double the price?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the plan. There's no doubt about that. But they've been quite bad at that in recent years. I mean, Bellingham and Hojlund are really the exceptions to the rule, because Dortmund used to be a lot better at developing players and selling them on. And then you look at some of the players they've signed in recent times, expensive older players like Seru Guirassy, who's obviously been a great hit for them. Valdemar Anton, a little bit more mixed, and Pascal Gross, they signed at 33, who is not really the guy to add energy to your midfield, even though he's been pretty good for Dortmund on the whole. Clearly, he's been exposed on a physical level at various points. So Dortmund are really trying to get back to what they feel they should be, an elite finishing school for players who hope to be at the absolute elite level of European football. Now, look, I think it's a massive stretch to say that Jobe can be as good as Jude, and maybe we should bin that comparison early on. But like we've said with a couple of other teams, with Manchester City, they want to get a bit younger in midfield. And I think the fact that they've got time to develop him with more experienced older midfield players around him. Felix Metscher's really settled, who you get on well with. He grew up in Manchester. He was in the Man City academy, so I think they'll probably click quite well. And Metscher has found his point in a deeper role in the team now, so that they could even fit together. Marcel Sabitzer is there as well. There are more experienced players that he could learn off. I think the idea is basically he'll take the place of Julian Brandt, and they will aim to sell Julian Brandt, who's had a bit of an up and down season. But I think they'll know that he understands the club already. He spent a bit of time around the club already with his family when he was a little bit younger. And I think in terms of the pressure, okay, there will be pressure to a certain degree. But I think, firstly, anyone sensible understands that he can't be Jude, that's not possible. And that's too much to expect that. But the other thing is that they will have looked at, the family will have looked at the way that Jude was looked after. And he arrived there. Really, it might not have quite come across in England like this, but he arrived really in the costume of a superstar already. The day he arrived at Dortmund, he landed at the airport, and Dortmund sent 3 different cars to pick him up. So 1 to actually pick him up, and 2 decoys to sort of send the press in the wrong direction. And that's the sort of pressure he had to deal with from minute 1. And in one of his first games when he played in the DFB Pokal, the cup, the early round, Torgan Hazard said to him, "God, you're not a kid, are you? You actually put yourself about like an adult, and he was a bit taken aback by it. So I think a Dortmund know from that perspective, they can't think that they're getting a player as good as Jude Bellingham, at least not yet. But what they know is what they're getting in terms of his attitude, his values, his fact that he's bold enough to grab the opportunity with both hands. And obviously they will hope to develop him, and if they ended up selling him for 100 million, then great. But I don't think they're going in there with the expectation of that. And as we say, their transfer policy has changed a little bit. So obviously because of his age, they will hope to develop him and sell him on for a profit later down the line. But what they're looking at now is some youth, some excitement, and some years of good service out of him. I think they will probably aim to keep him for a bit longer than they kept Jude.
Well, there you have it, Andy. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the talkSPORT YouTube channel. Let us know your thoughts on all of that transfer news. And remember, the window will be back tomorrow to keep you up to date with the latest rumours, done deals and everything in between.